All right, let's wrap this bad Larry up. We have ridden and reviewed 4 modern XC bikes. Again, the bikes are the Giant Anthem, Cruz Blur, Cervelo ZFS-5, and the Orbea Oiz. And now it's time to take a deep dive into comparisons between the bikes instead of reviewing each one individually. So we will be breaking them down by climbing performance, descending performance, and then at the end we'll talk about who each one is for. So stick around to see which one is going to be best for you. All right, let's jump into uphill performance. This is where these bikes are going to score the most points. This is where they were designed to shine. They are designed to get someone to the top of the mountain as quickly as possible. They're XC bikes. So climbing performance comes down to a couple of things, and as we should all know by now, a bike's efficiency isn't the only thing that determines how well it climbs. Climbing ability comes down to how well the body position, the geometry, and the suspension all work together to keep the bike moving forward as quickly as possible. So let's start with uphill efficiency and speed. We have a clear and obvious winner here, and it's a bit surprising to see this bike take the win. The Orbea Oiz has more travel than any other bike here, but it is the quickest to the top of the mountain. Its suspension is very XC, it's stiff and efficient. The Giant Anthem is close behind, although the Anthem has a much different feel. It goes about it in a different way. It uses Fox live valve to keep things firm and fast, kind of like the Oiz, but then the suspension can open up and be more active when you encounter bumps or steep terrain that requires a little extra traction. I found the Anthem to have the best suspension qualities in our entire test. Even if it's not the fastest uphill, it might be the best overall in terms of suspension. The Cervelo ZFS-5 slots in next with a bit more active suspension quality. It's got a bit more of that trail feel than the 2 previous bikes. Then last, in terms of efficiency at least, is the Cruz Blur. The Blur, by all means, has a very similar feel to the Cervelo, and it should. The kinematics are very similar. The Blur, for whatever reason, did feel a bit more active and a bit smoother through the bumps, and it certainly did provide the most traction. So speaking of traction, let's get into technical climbing ability, because traction is a huge factor in how well a bike handles technical terrain. So once the trail gets steep and bumpy, this is where you're going to wish you had a little bit more traction. Traction comes from the suspension design as well as tire selection and body position. If your weight isn't kind of equal over both of those wheels, you're going to struggle with traction. You know, too light on the front and it's going to wander and lift, too light on the back and you're going to spin out. Control is another factor in technical climbing ability. If you're in the wrong spot on the bike or the front end is too vague, you're going to struggle to get up the rough bits. So this list is almost like the inverse of the list before. The Blur here takes the cake, and it's largely because it offers a ton of traction and it offers great control and a good balance between front and back wheels. The ZFS-5, Anthem, and Oiz all kind of come in next, as they all do fairly well with tough climbs, and they kind of do it in a little bit different way. And I do think if the Anthem had a bit more relaxed riding position to it, I think it would handle technical climbs almost as well as the Blur. Then on the Oiz, I think a little bit more traction would go a long way in making that bike a little bit better technical climber. But its body position and geometry do offer a lot of control, and the efficiency is nice for just flying up stuff. So overall climbing ability in my mind comes down to 2 different things: the bike's efficiency and its technical climbing ability. And there are a few other factors such as comfort and body position. Even though it doesn't handle the technical stuff as well as some of the others in the group, the Oiz is kind of our clear winner in the climbing department. It is the best and fastest climber. The rest of the group isn't as clearly defined because they each have their own merits. The Cervelo offers a great balance between efficiency and control. The Blur is great on steep and bumpy climbs, and then the Anthem suspension quality is really tough to beat. And again, these are all XC bikes and they all do very well on the climb, so we are kind of getting a little bit nitpicky here. So downhill performance, let's talk about it, because these bikes I would argue have a priority of climbing, and descending kind of takes a back seat to that, but some of them actually descend very well. And this is also the part where I found more disparity between the bikes. All of the others were actually very close. We had to split hairs to differentiate them. The descents kind of spread these bikes apart. So there are a few ways to look at downhill performance. And it's important to keep in mind these are XC bikes, so we're not going to judge them the same way we would a trail or an all-mountain bike. At the end of the day, an XC bike should be quick and it should cover ground quickly, and it doesn't necessarily need to be burly. The other way to look at this is not everyone wants to race. Not everyone needs that fast bike, and some folks just want a bike that climbs really well and one that won't kill them on the downhill. So we'll look at this through a few different lenses. Let's start with suspension design and quality. The bike that surprised me the most here is the Giant Anthem. So even though it has the least amount of travel, the Anthem is surprisingly smooth and comfortable and very fun on the descents. I think live valve here is the kicker. It allows the bike to be more active just as its baseline because the electronic suspension can firm it up when needed. That active suspension quality is what made the bike so fun to ride. Had the cockpit and riding position not been so XC and aggressive, I think the Anthem would have found itself right in the mix with the Blur as the most capable and fun descender in our group. As is though, it's a little more suited for XC racing. Speaking of the Blur, it definitely takes the cake in the fun and capability departments, has the plushest suspension feel and a really good degree of confidence. The Cervelo ZFS-5 is actually very close to the Blur, but it did have a little bit firmer and stiffer feeling suspension for whatever reason, and it offered a little bit less braking and cornering traction. The Oiz on paper would appear to feel the biggest and deepest and the most trail, but that is not the case. If I didn't know better, I would have guessed it had the least travel or, the same amount as the Anthem. That said, its suspension is very adept at generating and maintaining speed. So it is a very, very fast bike, even on the downhill. If I had any interest in standing on an XC podium, it would be the bike I'd pick. The next big downhill component for me is geometry. It determines the bike's handling characteristics as well as plays a big factor in capability. The Cervelo has the slackest, most DH-friendly geometry, and that is apparent out on the trail. It felt comfortable at speed, it had the most trail handling characteristics, and then the Oiz had a very similar fit and feel actually. It is pretty confident at speed too, and it would need to be because it is fast. And while the braking traction on that bike wasn't the best, the cornering traction and handling were excellent. The Blur also felt very stable and confident, but not quite in the same way as the previous two bikes. It's a bit more XC in the geometry, and what kept it feeling stable and confident was its really good suspension. The Anthem is very XC in its geometry. It's very steep, it's got a short wheelbase, and that did keep the handling very, very sharp. Then you combine that with the ultra racy cockpit and things got ultra sharp. So overall on the descents, there were two standout bikes for me. One is the Blur being the most fun and the most capable and the most trail feeling. And then there's the Oiz, which was the fastest and quickest feeling bike. Although I did find myself very pleasantly surprised that none of these bikes tried to kill me on the downhill. I normally ride trail bikes. I was a little hesitant to ride a bunch of XC bikes, but everything went just fine. So let's get into the hard part. This is where I try to condense all of this information into a couple of little categories to help you find the best bike for you. So let's start with the group of XC racers. I can't begin to speak from an XC racer's perspective. I have done one XC race and that was more than enough for me. I can, however, speak to which bikes are the fastest, and at the end of the day, that's what's important to winning a race, or at least I think that's how it works. The Oiz is an obvious choice for folks who want to race. It's the fastest bike both up and down the mountain, covers ground very quickly. It would be a very good option for the racer. The Anthem is also another really good option for the racer because of its excellent suspension quality and handling characteristics. So now let's jump into the next category, and I see these as the endurance racers, those long XC events. While efficiency is still very important here, comfort and capability start to play a bigger role. Endurance races tend to cover a wide variety of terrain, and some of it does get pretty difficult. And it kind of goes without saying, it's an endurance event, so you're going to be on the bike for quite a while. So I did a 50-mile race back in the day, and if I had to do it again, I would grab the Blur. If that's not available, I'd take the ZFS-5 or the Oiz. All of those bikes have a more comfortable fit and feel, with the Blur also offering the most comfortable feeling suspension. Actually, none of those bikes are slouches on rougher downhill terrain either. And then the last category we should talk about are the trail riders. These are the folks who don't want to race. They are not interested in any sort of organized fitness measuring contest. They just want to go out. They want a bike that climbs well. They want a bike that doesn't kill them on the downhill and that's fun to ride. So for that category, I would easily recommend the Blur and the ZFS-5 because both of these bikes are exactly that bike. Interestingly, the Anthem I think could work here for the right rider too. I think you'd need to address the ultra racy cockpit and replace it with something a little more trail or average Joe friendly. But I think if you had, you know, a normal stem and some decent width handlebars, that bike would find itself in this category a little bit better, largely due to how well its suspension works. Although do keep in mind it doesn't have the same degree of capability as the Blur and the Cervelo ZFS-5. All right, thanks for sticking around. That will wrap it up for the 2023 Showdown. There's only one thing left to do.